"35 years after it was left for dead, Battersea Power Station is being restored. Designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, the man who created the red telephone kiosk, this London landmark was rescued by a Malaysian consortium, which selected architects Wilkinson Eyre to give it a new life.
The most incredible thing about it is the sheer scale of it. This absolutely enormous space. And then there's always more to discover as you go in a bit further, or you go up into one of either the switch houses on either side, and then you find those extraordinary control rooms, with it's sort of beautifully designed. Everything very carefully designed and worked through. It's just an awesome space.
Battersea Power Station was built for the London Power Company in the early 1930s when coal was king. It devoured 1 million tonnes a year brought in by rail and river.
When you look at the sheer scale of that building, probably against the context of that time, the buildings that were in the vicinity around it and on the opposite side of the river back in the 1930s were pretty low-scale buildings. This was an extraordinarily large thing to introduce into a city, bigger than stations, termini building, or anything for that matter, and bigger than any cathedral.
Battersea Power Station survived the Blitz, was doubled in size in the 1950s, 2 chimneys became 4. And exactly 50 years after opening, it was decommissioned and would have been demolished if it hadn't been for a campaign by Save Britain's Heritage.
I was rung up by the BBC nationwide, and they said to me, "Mr. Binney, Battersea Power Station is being demolished. Should it be saved?" I said, "Yes!" We had great trouble in getting in there, actually, and it was only through Tony Benn, the Labour Minister of Power, that we got the electricity board to let us in. We then had this grand tour of it and got very excited about the potential of it, because although the wonderful turbines were being stripped out of Turbine Hall A, we saw this magnificent turbine hall, the fantastic control room, and then control room B. It was a real magnificent interior, as well as the great landmark value with those soaring chimneys. We always said it is the Mount Everest of preservation. It is the most difficult thing of all. We did a very detailed scheme in this book called The Colossus of Battersea, and we showed how it could be converted for sports use and leisure use. About 5 years ago, the voices started saying, well, preservation's proved hopeless, it's just a no-goer, can't we just knock it down and have something new? So we did another scheme, this time with the architects Allies and Morrison. And all these schemes successively has come forward. There have been terrible hiccups, terrible setbacks, but now we hope we're on the final run.
Coming to this almost derelict building in 2013, Malaysian investors saw the potential for shops, offices and apartments. They employed the Uruguayan architect Rafael Vinoli to draw up a master plan and gained consent for enabling development, including the apartment blocks that have sprung up here, whose sale has helped finance the whole project.
It is unique. It's extraordinary that somebody initially would have decided to put a building like this potentially in the middle of the world's greatest city. If it was somewhere on the coast, it might not be quite so exciting, but it is that juxtaposition of this building and the city that's made it so incredibly interesting. So a huge challenge for the team, to keep that building alive. For 30 years, people tried, once the power had been turned off in 1983, to come up with an optimal development solution, and for 30 years they failed until our shareholders bought the site in 2013, and at which point very much turned the power back on. The short-term easy profit would be to take a flat piece of land, develop something which could be developed anywhere else. The guy that realises the optimal solution, the one that creates the longest value, the best use, is to actually celebrate that building and create it as a centrepiece, is the person who will ultimately succeed. So, frankly, a brave developer is the person who appreciates heritage and culture are things to be appreciated rather than things to be avoided as you try and get your best return on equity.
By now, the old power station was listed Grade 2 star, and the challenge for Jim Eyre and his team was how to design a commercially viable scheme while respecting the art embodied in Gilbert Scott's creation.
There's something really interesting about his work. I mean, there's definitely a sort of modernist edge to it somehow, but there's this kind of slightly idiosyncratic decoration that he introduces into his buildings, which I quite like, you know. And he's not afraid to use traditional materials, so he's no way is he an out-and-out modernist by any stretch of the imagination, but spatially he sort of seemed to think rather like a modernist. Gilbert Scott had this sort of, apart from the monumentalism, this quite frequent use of repetitive elements, you know, particularly lining up windows, lots of thin elements, one after the other, in a sort of regimented line. And when you look at the power station, it's the same. You know, it has those sorts of elements to it, that kind of repetition, accentuating, for instance, the sort of verticality to the power station, to sort of, you know, the sheer power and strength of these four towers, one at each corner. So, for instance, when we were looking at, well, how do you introduce windows into this building? You know, hardly any windows at all. Well, the right way to do it seemed to me, well, have lots and lots of very narrow ones and make them very tall and very, very thin and equally spaced. And it just seemed the right way to do it. So there were things that I think I learned about Giles Gilbert Scott, not particularly historical things, just looking at buildings and his work, that I think really helped when we started to look at, or were competing in fact, for the power station.
The architects drew up plans for retail in Battersea's two turbine halls, and in the main boiler house, offices. There'll be the European headquarters of Apple, with apartments above.
We've got an office component in the building which is in the region of 45,000 square metre, which is actually the scale of the Gherkin. And that part fit in the building. You know, the Gherkin, if you put it horizontally, it fit in the building, and it's only 35% of the building. And literally that element here will be here. The Gherkin will sit horizontally. It's 6-story high building, and that 6-story high building of the office is basically sandwiched between 3-story of retail, 2-story of event space, and 2-story of residential villas on top. So it really gives you an idea of scale, because that office element is like the scale of an internal street. So we have an internal atrium, a central atrium there, which is about 20 metre wide by 25 metre high. So that's, I don't know, it's Regent Street, you know, that's the kind of scale we're talking about, and that's just an internal component within the building. So it's phenomenal, and really it's something that very few of us would have ever had the chance to explore and to work with. It's a really unusual scale to deal with. Some of the first sketches we did when we did the competition was about trying to create those glimpses, those moments where, whether you are in a retail environment, whether you are in the office, you always you have a diagonal view which gives you a glance to the chimney or give you a glance to one of the existing malls, making sure that wherever you are in the building, when you are likely to be in the new built element, you always have a visual contact with the existing fabric. When they are in the existing fabric, we are exposing from the inside the brickwork. So we're not over-insulating them and covering them, we're exposing it. And again, you know, it will be the original brickwork. And you will have some embedded steel beam in them, so they will all be exposed, so you will see the roughness of the structure.
Sebastian Ricard oversees 30 architects who live and breathe Battersea Power Station. They're on site all day, every day, working alongside the engineers, surveyors and builders. It means they can respond instantly if any minor changes are needed.
What is great is there is not one typology. There's different typologies. We are dealing with offices, we are dealing with residential, we are dealing with retail. So it's not about applying a recipe, like some developer or client will want you to do, because you can't apply a recipe. The building fabric was made for something else. So it was much more about trying to find the quirkiness of the building and using that quirkiness to your advantage as designer. So in other words, it's about saying, well, we want to celebrate the industrial nature of the building. So it's not actually saying we want to make perfect wall. We want to expose the decay of the building. So we, for instance, here, we've got the main entrance of the building, the main facade, the south elevation, where what we didn't want it to do is to restore the facade. So what we're doing is creating what we call a bowstring structure at the back of it, which is normally a very lightweight structure, which is designed to support a glass facade normally. And here the reason we're using it is because it's very lightweight, so it basically doesn't detract visually from the brick element, the brick component of the facade, so we can see the roughness of the brick and we don't over-restore it. If there are some tags on the wall, we leave them. So this is an example of where we want people, when they come to the building, to just know what the building was for before. And it wasn't a pristine monument, it was an industrial building, so it was made for that, it needs to remain like that.
Reusing a building like this, the building doesn't have insulation, so you've got to think, well, how do we deal with that? We've got to bring it up to modern building regulations, fire standards, etc. There's a huge sort of degree of complexity involved in that. And how's it ventilated, and fresh air, warm air, and so on. And I think in many ways the real difficulty or challenge is the multiple uses in the building, actually. If it was all one thing, that removes a huge layer of complexity. But having multiple uses, because we have retail, quite a lot of retail, we've got leisure, office and residential. We've got new residential and converted units to residential. So we've got a whole range of different uses in one building, which is quite rare in this country. It's very rare that you get residential on top of offices, particularly in this country. It happens elsewhere, but not here. The space is on top of the building, you can build up. And then the sort of heart of the building does work quite well for offices, because you've got this great depth, far too much depth for residential. And we can carve out an enormous atrium in the centre, probably bigger than any other atrium in this country, but still get deep floor plans of over 20 metres, which is pretty much what the market would want for offices. And then the lower levels, it's really an internal environment, mainly with these two extraordinary turbine halls, is kind of ideal for retail uses.